And yes, I hand over to Nathan then. Thank you for the brilliant. So there we go. I'm going to switch off my mic and camera, and I'll hand over to you, Nathan, who's going to talk about fictions in the study of leadership, applying the philosophy of as if. Brilliant. Thank you.
Good morning. Many of the proposals and presentations at this conference have talked about reimagining. They've used different language, but the idea of using the imagination to think about what leadership might become, leadership studies might become. What I've encountered is the idea of the philosophy of as if, and I don't know what to do with it. You're going to give me a chance to think this through. My name is Nathan Harter. I teach at Christopher Newport University, small liberal arts public institution in Virginia in the United States. And this is the person whose book led me to ask some questions. Hans Weihinger, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, had a sad life. As a scholar, he became marginalized very quickly after his death and is only now receiving something of a comeback based largely on the work, the philosophy of as if. What I want to do is lay out some of what he argued and then talk about somebody who's picked it up recently and tried to see if he could extend it. And then I'm going to do the same with regard to leadership specifically. By the term fiction, what he means is something that is false, untrue, fabricated, incorrect, even nonsense, that contradicts what we know to be true. We use them all the time in etiquette or as metaphors. We also know that leaders often use them, deceit, lying, or fictions that are supposed to be uplifting, but also accusations of something like fake news. What I'm doing, because this is based on his work, is asking the question about its role in the study of leadership, knowing it to be a fiction and using it anyway. His point is that we do this all the time and that scientists know this to be the case. I didn't think this before I read his book. Colloquially, we say the sun is rising in the east, even though that's not a scientific claim. We know what you mean, and we can use that fiction usefully in day-to-day life. We see this in other fields. My field, in the law, we talk about corporations as persons, saying we know they're not, but we have found that it's useful to treat them as if. We do the same thing with the reasonable person standard in the common law. Politics, when you create the discussion of utopias, and I believe this will come up again in the next presentation of heterotopias, these are constructs that aren't true, and yet they have a function in our understanding, like ideal types with Max Weber. In logic, you have all these thought experiments that are conducted, the brains in a vat example, the trolley car that's about to hit somebody. This isn't true, but it is something we can imagine that helps us think through a problem. John Rawls famously on the veil of ignorance requires that you have this capacity. What if? Supposing. Let's play this out in our imagination, and that will educate us about what's going on. But Weihinger goes a lot further in arguing that the physical sciences are full of fictions as well. He claims that Sir Isaac Newton knew that gravity was a fiction, which I hadn't considered before, but he sees them all over the place in the physical sciences and chemistry. And in mathematics, of course, there's abounding evidence of imagination, imaginary numbers being the most obvious example. But what's the square root of -1? How can 1 times 1 equal 1? In algebra, this letter is treated as if it had a numerical value and so forth. And we do this and they have different functions. Sometimes it's called an eliminative function, and the eliminative function is when you propose it knowing it's not true as a placeholder, and then you do research, not a hypothesis. That's different, and I'll explain that in a minute. It's simply something we know to be untrue, but that for the time being, it will suffice. Another version is the instrumental function, which says we need this in order to process the science. I don't normally think of science working this way, and he gives me so many examples that I have to consider the possibility. What would this look like then in leadership studies? These are some examples, and they're tied to the examples he gives. A model or a schema itself is an abstraction, right? You've taken it out of its context. You've removed much of the real world in order to focus on a part, like the three-body problem in physics. This doesn't exist in reality. It's as if all other things being equal is a phrase we often use. So that in leadership studies, we might talk about the leader and the follower in some sort of dyad, as I mentioned here. Dichotomies. We have dichotomies all over the place in leadership studies. Theory X, theory Y, transforming, transactional leadership. These dichotomies are artificial. We know them to be artificial. We have taxonomies that are the same way. We create these categories knowing that there are exceptions and combinations. It has a use, and we're willing to have them in our study of leadership. But like it's Whitehead said, Lord North Whitehead, seek simplicity, then distrust it. I've always used that as a motto ever since I learned that quote. Seek simplicity, then distrust it. Even the idea of an identity is a fiction, and I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Clearly, the vision is something that doesn't exist except in the imagination, but we are going to take action as if we are going to bring it about. Hume already cast doubt on the idea that there's such a thing as causation, but in leadership, we frequently want to study the agency of the person we call the leader as though they cause something to happen. I'm going to go so far as to say, is it possible leadership is a fiction? More and more, I'm encountering historians who are critical of the work I and we are doing because they would say there are too many of these variables intermersed and they're flowing and intersecting that you can't attribute social change to individual social actors. And Durkheim in sociology made a similar claim that you can't do this. And yet we do it all the time. Is this a fiction? Well, that's a troubling possibility to me, but it's one that I want to address. If that's true, if he's correct, I'm doing a what if here, our task as scholars will be to recognize what are the useful fictions that we're using. What are they? Second, can we discard those that are unhelpful? I think Antonio's presentation was an attempt to ask us to discard some fictions that are not helpful. And finally, perhaps invent new ones as needed. I would have thought a conference like this was an attempt to invent fictions. The problem is that we don't want to call them fictions. And that's where I'm having trouble. Here's how he sees this working, and I'll connect it to leadership studies. When you have dogma, which are claims you assume to be true, you accept them. Hypotheses, which are possibly true, but require some sort of work to figure out, is this true or not? And then fictions. He's saying that there is a shift that occurs in the study of anything. Among these three categories, you can shift from one to another as you learn new things. So what I want to do is give two examples. First, shifting from dogma to fiction. Great man theory. When Carlyle wrote about this, he was already lamenting the fact that it was being questioned. It had been dogma. He didn't impose it or suggest it for the first time. He was saying it's going away, and he wanted to defend it. Since then, it became something of a hypothesis that was considered in leadership studies as they looked at it and tried to figure out what do you mean by great? Why is it restricted to men? Is it really a theory that we can use? And eventually we decided it's more of a fiction. And it's a fiction that maybe isn't useful. It can be useful for teaching. It can be useful to describe sort of popular psychology as to why certain people vote the way that they do is that they are still committed to a version of the great man theory. So we may know it to be a fiction, but it's useful in explaining other people's behavior. I want to go the other direction, however, and talk about something else, both of which were mentioned by Antonio, so I thank him, and that's systems thinking. In 1992, when Margaret Wheatley was talking about systems thinking, it's unclear the extent to which she treated it as a metaphor. That in the natural sciences, we see systems thinking. So let's see what it might mean if we imported it into leadership. Well, since then, a number of people have turned it into a hypothesis and have been doing the research. Mary Yule Bean being a good example. The presenter that follows, William Donaldson, has done this as well, trying to say, what would this look like? How can we do research into systems thinking? How can we then fit it into our research agenda? But it has become dogma for some people, as Barbara Kellerman indicated when she wrote in Daedalus that leadership is a system and we simply have to accept it. These shifts are things for us to pay attention to. And I think that is fair. When are you using a fiction? When is it a hypothesis and when is it dogma? More recently, Kwame Anthony Apaya has written on the philosophy of as if, kind of resurrecting it, and helped me in trying to appreciate the importance of this. He was giving a series of lectures on this topic. He had already written in this tone. He had written, for example, about identity, because he himself was from Ghana and how living in the West, he's a homosexual man in a culture that is still trying to sort through that identity. And directly in another book talks about identity as a fiction, but it's a necessary fiction. I am not what my identity says that I am, but it's helpful for me to use this. And then when I interact with other people, the same is true. He also talks about honor societies, that it is honorable to do certain things, dueling and foot binding and so forth. And he's saying that there's a role for fictions that we might need to question, that there are fictions underlying the honor system that need to be challenged and discarded. But he does reduce this to two things of direct relevance to leadership. They're both involving what he calls cognitive angels. I think it's an interesting phrase. One is the process of generating an avatar that we send out in our imagination to do things. They are not real, they're possible characters, possible pathways that we could take. If I were to do this, I could contract a disease. If I were to do this, I might be arrested. And as we send out these avatars in our imagination, we can then prepare a possible future. We do it as if we were guilty of these things, as if we showed up, as if we took this action. And we do this in preparation for the future all the time. He says this is a part of what differentiates us from the animals. It's an evolutionary advantage that we have to be able to cast ourselves into these predicaments so that we don't actually have to suffer the consequences. But there's another use of this as if, and that is to treat other people, not ourselves casting into the future, but mostly with regard to demographics, like in marketing, but in also politics. There's a cognitive angel that we might call an older voter or a teenage consumer. We have profiles very similar to what social media does. These cognitive angels that we treat not because they are real flesh and blood, but because it's convenient for us to have simplification. And the closer we can get to reality, perhaps the better, but we know they're fictions. We accept that they're fictions. They're useful fictions. I would conclude by referring to a book that had a big impact on me, and I don't see cited in the literature on leadership nearly often enough, by Bruce Maslish. I think this is a powerful book and his insights are helpful. One of which is, what do followers actually follow? We tend to say the leader, right? But he emphasizes it's an image in your own mind. The follower has an image, and I want to emphasize that we can talk about this in more detail. There's a dramaturgical dimension to leadership in which we are enacting something. I have in my imagination what the story is. I have in my imagination how this is all going to go. I have imagination who you are as a leader. There's no way we know many of these leaders personally, that we know them intimately, that we have an objective acquaintance with these people. It's the image. And I often teach this by using the example of the writer who wrote on the best editor he ever knew. And he talks about this fellow when he was starting out, crusty old figure in the corner office with a mustache and a sweater, and he would try to live up to the standards of this man. At the editor's retirement, the writer went to ask him how he became an editor, and the man said, I never thought I was. I didn't see myself as an editor. I would ask you, are you happy with it? And if you said no, I would hand it back to you. I trusted you to edit these things. I think we do this all the time. We have an image in our head. Foucault does the same thing when he talks about the training of leaders in 1,000 years during the Hellenic period, when the idea was to implant in the leader's imagination a character who holds them accountable, not unlike a conscience. And that if you can train people to have that character in their imagination judging their behavior, they're more likely to behave properly. Again, as if there's another person, an angel on the shoulder. I'm just throwing out some possibilities for discussion, but I think it might be fruitful if you would give me some time and tell me what you think.
Wow, thank you, Nathan. Oh, I've got an echo again. It really is a session of rebooting leadership thought here, isn't it? And you clearly do some really interesting, wider reading around. You know, I was obviously in your talk earlier on about, or yesterday, Polanyi as well. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to the floor with their thoughts and questions. So Willie, go ahead.
Nathan, as always, I'm both inspired and maddened by you, inspired by your incredible insights and maddened by the same. Two things. One is, you know, my love for systems thinking, and you know, this goes right back to what the systems teaches us, is that the longest lever in changing the system is the mental models, the paradigms people use to see their world. So I completely agree with you. I mean, I think it's this envisioning of leaders, and Sarah and I are going to talk about this with this, you know, what we think we see. And the other thing is you had a set of tasks for academics, and I would encourage you to add, be explicit about when you're using these and how you view the model in your own head, so that somebody can get themselves oriented to that. But no, I think it was terrific, and I'm inspired as always.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. It's a challenge to present this to students.
Yeah.
When we teach them on various theories, and a lot of them think that my job is to replace their implicit leadership theory with the right answer. And what I'm trying to do is disabuse them of the idea that there is a right answer, but instead to regard these as alternatives, different lenses we might use. The what if, philosophy of what if, doesn't come easily to some of them because they're waiting for me to deliver on the goods, and I'm trying to disabuse them of that. So that's a frustration I have as an educator.
I couldn't agree more. And you and I've talked about Cabrera's juxtaposition of VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, you know, word, and the way we teach people as being LAMO, you know, linear and anthropocentric and mechanistic, and we've just got to break that cycle, I think. And it's not either or, it's both and, as we've talked about so often.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Willie. Both Fidel and Sarah put on their cameras, but should we go to Fidel first? Or Sarah first? You put on your camera again, you beat him to it.
Okay, I'll just lean in. So thank you, Nathan. It's such a pleasure to hear you talk. I was interested in the Maslish, which I don't know, and just a query, does he talk about implicit leadership theory, or is he a precursor to that notion?
I'm not aware that he's familiar, I'll be honest. He comes out of what he calls psychohistory, so he's studying events in the past and trying to make sense of it using the lens of psychology.
Yeah.
And a part of what he's doing is instead of talking about going forward, how do I take action based on what I assume or believe, he's talking about how do we understand what happened in the past using lenses that are available to us today. And so he's going to say it helps us to remember that the followers at that time were not operating according to the reality that history teaches us. They were responding to what they imagine. And if we take that into account, then what we happen to know in history, we say, well, we know Nixon is a crook. Why would anybody vote for him? Well, at the time, first of all, a lot of people weren't following Nixon the crook. They didn't even know anything about this, or if they did, they found it compatible with some dramaturgical image of the leader. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So there's something about what's become like a settled version of history that informs people's thinking about leadership, and because I do the same thing in my classes. I say, what the common good is becomes a settled matter later sometimes. Like in the moment, it's not settled. So we're not even going to talk about that. Let's talk about something that is more of a settled matter. Sometimes I put it that way. Thanks, Nathan, and thanks for your teeing us up for what's coming next.
I hope so.
Everything's been teed along, doesn't it? As if it was done perfectly. So, Fidel, go on. You put your, and then I see Chi, you've got a question afterwards. So, Fidel, should we go first?
Yeah, no, I was going to defer, but obviously you're putting me on the spot. I mean, I liked, Nathan, I liked the whole idea of implanting some sort of something in the heads of leaders so that those people in their heads become more or less like their masters and help them to control their impulse.
Right.
So that's something which I found very inspiring. And then I was wondering, what can we do for some of those rogue leaders who may not have those angels to help them to go to back to the normal path?
I'm not going to be a defeatist and say for most of them it's too late, although that's probably true in some cases. They're too developed in their thinking psychologically. But the primary focus on this from Foucault was involving the training of young people to become leaders, that while they're still impressionable. However, I will put this as a caveat. I do think a lot of leaders have in their imagination the judgment of the media or history. And that if you can implant in their imagination as if history were being written about their leadership, they may rethink some of the decisions they make.
Interesting thought. Chi, go ahead.
Okay, Nathan, thank you for your so deep and so insightful ideas. I like your idea, and actually it helps open one door to one of the problems which troubled me for several years. I'm always questioning about the use of theories and models, etc. to start my, I'm a social scientist. Those field work, you have to have, doesn't matter what. I'm trained as more of a qualitative methodology person. Even so, even using grounded theory, I still cannot avoid starting my project, designing, etc., with some frameworks and models. And I'm wondering, because what you said reminded me Confucius' idea of Confucius always said there's no divide between the universe of appearance and the universe of essence. So fiction and the non-fiction are together. They're one thing. So why do we need to start with some fiction and models, etc.? If you say these are fictions, I'm wondering, do you have any magic that we can avoid using that theory, that fictions, that models, etc., to start with the project?
No, I appreciate that. I think as a diagnostic tool for what scholars are doing, this can be helpful to ask, what framework did they use to begin? How did they approach this? Knowing that there were alternatives. You can't do all of them simultaneously. That's not possible and it's not healthy. So many scholars, as Dr. Donaldson suggested, will make explicit the framework, and they'll say, this is what I'm using. There could have been others. Just like in an abstraction, I'm going to isolate my concentration on these factors. I realize there are others, but for my purposes, I'm going to restrain it this way. This is a version of fictions that I think is healthy, to be able to delimit what it is you're doing and make it clear to your reader what you're doing, not discounting the possibility that there's another way, that there are other variables we could introduce later, so that it's a fiction that's useful to communicate a finding, but not to embrace it so much that we forget that there's a whole vast universe beyond.
Thank you. And I'm thinking about, can we start without any models? That's one thing. I'm thinking and this year, so I'm doing research. Can we start with a mess, with a chaos? This is probably a question for us to think.
I agree. And yesterday I talked to Michael Polanyi, who would say we always have tacit knowledge. We always are working from a framework. We're not always conscious of what it is. And so to understand anything, we need this other larger framework that's going to impose itself. Otherwise, it's just, as William James would say, this, what is it? I forget the quote. It's just this confusion, never-ending confusion that doesn't mean anything. In order to derive meaning, we have to impose some kind of order, and the brain will do that whether we want it to or not. According to Polanyi, why not be explicit?
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've just got time for Antonio. You've got your hand up, so we've got time for one last question. So it's perfect timing.
Yes, Nathan, thank you very much. That was fascinating. You made me think about this idea of leadership as a social myth to create social orders, and also leadership as a discourse that is functional to the dominant, powerful social system. So my question is, because it's clear that even if it's a social myth, a discourse, and what you say, a fiction, it works. So my question is, do you think we can use it for creating this social change and another more fair social justice system? And what are the ethical implications there?
No, it's an excellent question, in part because I'm not sure what to do with this. I've already said being explicit and identifying the myths that don't work, which I think is a part of what you were trying to do. This is a myth and we ought to discard it in favor of another. What I'm interested in mostly is the third alternative, which is inventing new ones. Knowing it's a myth, I think that's where we have to look at artists. I think artists are going to lead the way here, whether it's through cinematography or painting, poetry, fiction, literal as an art. I think that may be where we're going to draw. So that the folks who are going out there and saying, here's a character that introduces a whole different way for us to think about leadership, that might be a source for scholars to draw on. That's the one that fascinates me the most, is how do we generate new myths, knowing them to be myths.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Nathan, for another hugely thought-provoking session. So.